Well, here we are, gathered to celebrate the life and puzzle over the death of Indonesia's most famous human rights and anti-corruption activist, who was assassinated in September 2004, 6 years ago. This lecture held in his honor helps us to remember all defenders of human rights in Indonesia and elsewhere, particularly at the moment in Russia, where the second has been gunned down on the doorstep, who've been killed or disappeared without justice. The disgraceful failure of the Indonesian authorities to properly investigate and punish those responsible for Munir's death and the deaths of hundreds of thousands of victims of state violence across Indonesia in the past force us to consider the issue of impunity, freedom that tyrants and troops should never have to kill their own people and to go unpunished. The word impunity came into legal language on the 6th of January 1649 in this country, when Parliament created a court to prosecute its head of state, King Charles I, for torturing and organizing and for command responsibility of troops who tortured parliamentary prisoners of war. It said that no chief magistrate should destroy the liberties of the British nation and expect impunity for so doing. So it has been a long time since that vision of Cromwell and the parliamentary lawyers has been set up as a challenge, and it took a long time. It took until Nuremberg when it became any sort of reality. It still is far from settled as a matter of law. Today, George Bush has confessed to ordering waterboarding, which everyone accepts, except for CIA lawyers who advised him, passes the severe pain threshold of the definition of torture in international law and in the Torture Convention. Like General Pinochet, he's an ex-head of state, so he's not entitled to immunity from arrest and trial. He says he was advised by CIA lawyers that waterboarding didn't constitute torture, but ignorance of the law is no defense, especially to someone who avoided fighting in Vietnam by doing a law degree at Yale. He won't be prosecuted in America, and of course he's outside the jurisdiction of the International Criminal Court because he, above anyone, avoided and determined not to ratify that treaty. But like General Pinochet, he could be subject to arrest were he to travel to a European country that accepts or ratifies the Torture Convention obligation to either try a suspect for torture or to extradite to a country that will. Mind you, George Bush has never much been interested in other countries. When he became president, he hadn't visited any except for Mexico. So I'm sure that he made the statements in his book that he ordered torture, having been advised of the potential consequences. And I don't think he obviously didn't have any interest in visiting Europe anytime soon. But the second irony, of course, is that this is the day that President Obama, his successor, who does regard waterboarding as torture, we're told, visits his old stamping ground when he was a street urchin in Jakarta in the 60s, in the mud and slush of the Jakarta streets. I think he's having some difficulty getting in because there's a volcano somewhere near that's threatening Air Force One, and maybe they're still circulating. But it's will be a different visit, of course, to that which I remember so well, and such a disgraceful visit, the visit of President Ford and Henry Kissinger to a country which waited until their flight, until Air Force One had just arisen or took off past all the planes that were going to land and demolish the liberation movements in East Timor. So at least it will be a happier visit this time. We've got to ask, I think, what can we as international lawyers and the international community do to ensure accountability and support our colleagues in Indonesia in their quest for justice. Human rights are universal, and grave breaches of international law must concern us all. As Munir himself said when he received the Right Livelihood Prize, it's called the Alternative Nobel Peace Prize, in 2000 he said this: "Human rights in the sense of human solidarity has created a new universal and equal language going beyond racial, gender, ethnic or religious boundaries. That is why we consider it a doorway to dialogue for people of all socio-cultural groups and all ideologies." In this lecture, I want to consider the question of when human rights defenders are murdered with impunity and the state fails to bring the perpetrators to justice, what can be done to ensure accountability and improve the protection of those most at risk. Then I want to ask what support can we provide as international lawyers, and finally, what is the role of regional mechanisms, international tribunals, truth commissions and the like in this exercise. But first, a word about the man, a fierce human rights advocate who worked tirelessly to end impunity in Indonesia. And it was obviously for that work that he was later murdered by the security apparatus of the state. And it's a cruel irony that his own case is now a symbol of ongoing impunity in Indonesia. He began his career with the Indonesian Legal Aid Foundation in Surabaya, made famous by the song. He became one of Indonesia's leading human rights campaigners, and he suffered regular death threats and several assassination attempts at the end of the Suharto regime. That regime was characterized, of course, by corruption. I've just been reading Jimmy Wolfenson's autobiography. He was the head of the World Bank at the time. He went and tried to argue with Suharto to limit corruption, and at the end he says Suharto got very angry with him. He said, "You call it corruption, I call it family." But at the end of that period, when pro-democracy activists were being abducted in suspicious circumstances, Munir founded the human rights organization Contras, the Commission for Disappearances and Victims of Violence. He was known as for his role in uncovering and raising awareness about Indonesian military human rights violations in East Timor, West Papua and Aceh, as well as military corruption and illegal logging in West Papua. He made, in other words, a lot of enemies. His notable cases are too many to mention, but probably he's most famous for the role he played in the prosecution or attempted prosecution of Indonesian military and militia officials for the violence in the aftermath of the UN elections in East Timor in 1999. I'll tell you a little about the background to that later, but the world was shocked at the brutality, and Munir was appointed a member of the commission to investigate the violations, which was set up by Indonesia's Human Rights Commission, and his investigations produced a wealth of evidence of the Indonesian army's involvement in recruiting, financing and training the militias. And his report was the basis for prosecutions and for investigations right at the top into General Wiranto. It was lauded, the commission that he led, in retrospect, was a remarkable exercise in investigation and accountability. Crimes against humanity alleged against 33, I think, military officers. and its independence, its objectivity, and his own bravery in reaching those conclusions and calling for accountability in the highest echelons of the army is remarkable, and I'll come back to that. But he was also on the drafting committee that drafted the Human Rights Court law establishing the courts that would ultimately try, or at least try to try, those military leaders, and that those courts are still operating today and offer a potential mechanism for dealing with crimes against humanity. But he was a visionary, and his loss continues to be felt. He won a number of human rights awards, notably, as I mentioned, the Right Livelihood Award, and he's the second winner of that award to be killed. Ken Saro-Wiwa in Nigeria is the other. As Indonesia's president, Yudhoyono famously said, "Munir's case will be the test of our history." And it's a test that Indonesia thus far has abjectly failed. You've heard a little about how he was assassinated by arsenic at Singapore airport while he was taking the Garuda flight to Amsterdam, and he fell severely ill and was found dead on arrival. And there was an independent fact-finding team set up, but its report, which came out in July of 2005, has never been published. But it recommended the prosecution of senior officials in the state intelligence agency, which must have been responsible. There were no less than 26 telephone calls between the Garuda pilot, who was eventually prosecuted, and the deputy head of the intelligence agency in the day or so before the poisoning. And it is the failure of the Indonesian authorities to get to the true people responsible in the shadowy intelligence agency for giving the orders for his death that is most unsatisfying. Of course, the pilot, who was clearly the end man, the hit man, if you like, with the arsenic, but he's out of prison after being inside for only 2 years. Someone else, another, I think, Garuda employee, was convicted but hasn't gone to prison, and it's really totally unsatisfactory. The National Human Rights Commission team investigating the case concluded that the prosecution had been, and I quote, "strangely unprofessional for a case with such incredible public exposure," and it's called for a case review of the acquittal and the appointment of more independent and impartial judges than can be found on the Supreme Court at the moment. So this is really a damning indictment of Indonesia.